There's a dangerous assumption people make about empaths, one that eventually costs them everything. They assume that patience, because it seems endless from the outside, actually is endless. That no matter how many times they cross a line, disappoint, take advantage, or dismiss what the empath needs, there will always be more tolerance waiting on the other side. This assumption isn't just wrong. It's the exact miscalculation that precedes every irreversible ending this kind of relationship ever has. To understand why this mistake gets made so consistently, you have to understand what empathic tolerance actually looks like from the outside, compared to what it costs on the inside. An empath's patience isn't passive. It isn't the absence of pain or frustration. It's active, ongoing labor, a continuous choice to extend understanding, to offer another chance, to interpret hurtful behavior through the most generous lens available. Every act of that patience draws from a finite well, even when it doesn't look finite to the person benefiting from it. This is where a concept from stress physiology becomes relevant, what researchers call allostatic load, the cumulative wear a body and nervous system experience from repeated stress, even when each individual stressor seems manageable on its own. An empath absorbing disrespect, dismissal, or exploitation isn't experiencing isolated incidents. They're accumulating damage, quietly, invisibly, long before any external sign shows up. The person causing that damage often assumes that because nothing has broken yet, nothing ever will. But allostatic load doesn't work that way. It compounds silently until it doesn't. Gabor Maté's work on the connection between suppressed emotional needs and eventual breakdown is essential here. He's written extensively about how the body and psyche can tolerate enormous strain for years, appearing functional, even generous, right up until the moment they can't anymore. The empath who has stayed patient through years of being taken for granted isn't immune to breaking. They're simply better than most people at concealing how close they already are to it. This is precisely what makes the eventual break so much harder to reverse than people expect. When someone with a shorter fuse gets angry, there's often a familiar cycle: conflict, cooling off, repair. But an empath's patience wasn't a short-term reaction to be waited out. It was a long-term investment, built and drained over months or years. When that investment finally runs dry, you're not dealing with a temporary flare of frustration. You're dealing with the final withdrawal from an account that's been overdrawn for longer than you ever realized. There's a philosophical dimension worth naming here too. Aristotle warned against mistaking patience for an unlimited virtue, understanding instead that even the most generous character requires reciprocity to sustain itself. Patience without any return eventually stops being virtue and starts being self-erasure. An empath who finally reaches the bottom of their tolerance isn't failing at compassion. They're finally refusing to let compassion consume them entirely. This is the warning most people don't heed until it's too late. You don't get a preview of the bottom. There's no gradual decline you can watch coming. No dramatic warning shot fired before the well finally runs dry. One day, the patience that always seemed inexhaustible simply isn't there anymore, and no amount of pleading, promising, or apologizing can refill something that took years to drain. You mistook their patience for infinite. It never was. It was simply the last thing they were willing to give you before they finally stopped giving anything at all. Most people expect a breaking point to look loud. They've been conditioned by every dramatic portrayal of conflict to expect a final argument, a slammed door, a scene dramatic enough to match the years of hurt that preceded it. This is precisely why so many people never see an empath's true ending coming. It doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives with silence. And by the time that silence registers as permanent, the door has already closed. To understand why an empath's exit looks so different from what people expect, you have to understand what they've already survived before reaching that point. For years, likely, they tried the loud version. They voiced concerns. They asked for change. They explained, repeatedly, what hurt and why. That version of confrontation, the version people fear and prepare for, already happened, quietly, long before the actual ending. What people are witnessing at the moment of the break isn't the first attempt to be heard. It's the aftermath of every attempt that failed to produce any real change. This is where a concept from behavioral psychology becomes essential. What's known as extinction. The process by which a behavior stops occurring once it consistently fails to produce a result. An empath's pleading, their explaining, their repeated attempts at being understood, this was a behavior reinforced, for a time, by the hope that it might eventually work. Once that hope is exhausted, once the behavior has been tried enough times without producing genuine change, it doesn't intensify, it extinguishes entirely. What looks like a sudden disappearance is actually the final stage of a process that had been building invisibly for a long time. There's a psychological concept worth introducing here too, something researchers call decision fatigue, applied to relationships specifically. Every time an empath chose to stay, to forgive, to try again, that decision cost something. Eventually, the cognitive and emotional resources required to keep making that same decision simply run out. What replaces the decision to stay isn't a decision to fight. It's an absence of any further decision at all. A quiet acceptance that the effort is no longer worth what it costs. This is also where attachment theory offers something important to understand. Securely developing attachment includes what's called protest behavior, the instinct to reach, cry out, or fight for connection when it feels threatened. But protest behavior has a limit. When reaching consistently fails to bring anyone closer, the nervous system eventually shifts into something researchers call detachment, a protective withdrawal that prioritizes self-preservation over continued pursuit of a connection that isn't coming. What you're witnessing when an empath finally goes quiet isn't apathy. It's the nervous system making a decision the conscious mind stopped being able to make for itself. This is the part that catches people off guard every time. They expect a warning. They expect one final fight, one last chance to make things right before it's truly over. But by the time an empath reaches the point of walking away silently, the warning's already happened, repeatedly, and were not heard. The silence isn't the beginning of the ending. It's the announcement that the ending already occurred, quietly, sometime before you were paying close enough attention to notice. You were waiting for the explosion that would tell you it was over. It already was. You just weren't listening when the silence started fames. There's a mistake people make once an empath finally begins to withdraw, and it's an understandable one, because it worked before. They assume that with enough time, enough apology, enough performed remorse, the same well of compassion that once forgave everything will eventually open back up. They wait for it, sometimes for years, convinced that the empathy they exploited is simply dormant, not gone. This is where they miscalculate most severely, because what they damaged was never designed to regenerate the same way twice, not for them. To understand why, you have to understand what compassion actually is at a psychological level when it's censure. Directed repeatedly at the same source of harm, compassion isn't an infinite, self-renewing resource that exists independent of experience. It's built, partly, on a kind of implicit trust, a belief that extending understanding to this particular person will eventually be met with change, care, or reciprocity. Every time that trust is violated, and the compassion is extended anyway, something subtle happens beneath conscious awareness. The nervous system begins encoding this specific relationship as unsafe to be vulnerable toward, even while the empath consciously continues trying. This is where a psychological principle from conditioning becomes relevant, this time in the form of what's sometimes called learned unresponsiveness. Just as an organism can learn that certain painful stimuli are inevitable and stop reacting to protect itself, an empath's psyche can learn that offering compassion to a specific person consistently leads to further harm. When that learning finally completes, and it always eventually completes, the emotional response doesn't just quiet down toward that person, it functionally shuts off. As a form of protection, the psyche installs without asking permission. This distinction matters enormously, because it explains why an empath's compassion can remain fully intact toward everyone else in their life, toward strangers, toward new relationships, toward the next person who earns their trust, while remaining permanently unavailable to the specific person who exhausted it. This isn't inconsistency, it's precision. The damage isn't global, it's targeted, directed specifically at the relationship that taught the nervous system it wasn't safe to keep giving there. Bessel van der Kolk, research on trauma, offers language for why this shift feels so permanent once it occurs. The body, he explains, keeps a record of what it learned to survive, and that record doesn't get erased, simply because the danger has passed, or the person has apologized. An empath who finally stops extending compassion toward someone who exploited it isn't choosing coldness. Their body already made that decision, somewhere beneath conscious thought, long before their mind caught up and accepted it. This is why apologies that arrive after the compassion has already shut down so rarely land the compassion in a way the person offering them expects. They're often sincere. They're often, finally, exactly what the empath once needed to hear. But sincerity delivered after the protective mechanism has already installed itself doesn't reopen what's closed. It simply confirms, painfully, that the understanding arrived too late to matter to the part of them that needed it most. You assumed their compassion was a well that would always refill itself for you specifically, no matter how many times you drew from it carelessly. It wasn't. What you damaged wasn't a renewable resource. It was trust. And trust, once withdrawn by the nervous system itself, doesn't return just because you're finally ready to deserve it. If you've ever tried to provoke a reaction out of someone who used to give you everything and found nothing there, no anger, no hurt, no flicker of the old response you used to be able to count on, you've encountered something far more unsettling than rage. You've encountered genuine indifference, and if you're honest with yourself, it disturbed you more than any argument ever could. That's not an accident. Indifference from a broken empath isn't the absence of feeling. It's a language you were never taught to speak, and one you have no idea how to counter. To understand why this response is so uniquely disarming, you have to understand what you were actually fluent in before this point. You knew how to work with anger, because anger gives you something to respond to argue against, to eventually wear down through persistence or charm. You knew how to work with hurt, because hurt implies attachment, and attachment can be leveraged, reignited, manipulated back into engagement. What you were never trained for, because it never used to exist in this relationship, is total emotional neutrality directed at you specifically. This is where a concept from clinical psychology becomes essential: the distinction between emotional suppression and genuine emotional resolution. Suppression is effortful. It requires ongoing energy to maintain, and it usually leaks out eventually, through tension, through subtle hostility, through cracks in the composed exterior. What you're witnessing in a truly broken empath isn't suppression, it's resolution. The nervous system has finished processing what happened, integrated the lesson, and moved the entire relationship into a category that no longer requires active emotional management. That's why it doesn't leak. There's nothing left underneath fighting to get out. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the philosophical discipline of directing your attention only toward what remains within your control, and treating everything else with a kind of practiced detachment, not from cruelty, but from wisdom. What you're encountering in an empath's indifference is something close to that stoic principle, fully realized. They haven't decided to punish you with coldness. They've simply stopped allocating any attention to a relationship that consistently proved itself unworthy of it. Indifference, at this level, isn't a performance directed at you. It's the complete absence of you from their internal calculations. This is precisely why manipulation tactics that once worked so reliably now fail completely. Guilt requires the target to still care about how they're perceived by you. Charm requires the target to still find something appealing about re-engaging. Every manipulation strategy depends on some remaining emotional investment to exploit, and indifference removes that investment entirely. You're not dealing with someone resisting your influence. You're dealing with someone who has nothing left inside that responds to it at all. There's something almost existentially unsettling about being met with real indifference, after being used to being someone's entire emotional world. It confronts you with a truth most manipulators spend their whole lives avoiding, that your effect on someone was never guaranteed, permanent, or owed to you. It was extended, and it can be, and eventually was, fully withdrawn. You spent years assuming their emotional response to you was inevitable, something you could always provoke if you tried hard enough. What you're facing now proves otherwise. Their silence isn't a wall waiting to be broken. It's a language of total detachment, and no version of you left fluent enough in charm or guilt to translate it back into anything you can use for eights. There's something an empath gave you that you likely never fully recognized while you had it, something far more valuable than patience or compassion alone. They gave you their vision of who you could become. Every excuse they made for your behavior, every time they saw potential where others saw only patterns, every moment they interpreted your worst actions through the lens of your best possibilities, that was a kind of mirror, generously held up, reflecting back a version of you that was better than what you were actually showing them. Once that mirror shatters, you're left facing something you haven't seen in a long time: yourself. without their interpretation softening the view. To understand what's actually being lost here, you have to understand the psychological function that mirror was serving. Developmental psychologists have long studied what's called mirroring in early relationships, the way a caregiver reflects a child's emotional experience back to them, helping that child develop a coherent sense of self. What an empath often does, unconsciously, in adult relationships, is a version of this same function, reflecting back not just who you are, but who you're capable of becoming, offering that reflection as a kind of ongoing invitation toward growth. For a long time, you may have mistaken that generous reflection for objective reality. It wasn't. It was a gift, extended repeatedly, at real cost to the person offering it. This is where Jacques Lacan's concept of the mirror stage becomes useful, even applied loosely outside its original developmental context. Lacan described how we come to understand our own identity, partly through how we're reflected back by others, how the image we receive shapes the image we internalize. An empath's generous mirroring wasn't just kindness. It was actively participating in constructing a version of you that you got to believe was accessible, achievable, already partially true. When that mirror disappears, you don't just lose their perception of you. You lose a scaffold your own self-concept may have been quietly leaning on for longer than you realized. This is precisely why the aftermath of losing an empath's belief in you often feels so disorienting, even for people who never consciously valued what they were receiving. Without their generous interpretation, you're left with whatever reflection remains, your own unfiltered self-assessment, the assessments of people less inclined toward charitable interpretation, and eventually, the accumulating evidence of your own choices, no longer softened by someone determined to see your potential over your patterns. There's a harder truth embedded in this too, one worth naming directly. The version of you the empath reflected was never entirely false, but it was also never entirely earned. It was aspirational, held out as something to grow into, sustained by their continued willingness to believe you would. When you exploited that belief instead of honoring it, you weren't just damaging the relationship. You were forfeiting access to the most generous interpretation of yourself you may ever receive from another person again. This is what people rarely understand until it's already gone. Losing an empath isn't just losing their presence. It's losing the version of yourself that existed only in their eyes, sustained by a patience and belief you're unlikely to encounter again in quite the same form. You're not just facing life without them. You're facing yourself, for the first time in years, without anyone generous enough to see past what you actually did nust. There's an assumption that quietly persists in the mind of anyone who's ever hurt an empath badly enough to lose them. The assumption that healing, whenever it finally happens, will eventually circle back and make room for reconciliation. That somewhere in the empath's future growth, there's a chapter reserved, waiting, for the version of you who finally gets it right. This assumption is one of the most consistently wrong beliefs a person can carry, because healing, real healing, doesn't work that way. It doesn't build toward reunion. It builds toward a future that simply doesn't include you at all. To understand why, you have to understand what healing actually requires at a structural level. It's not a process of waiting, hoping the source of harm will eventually change and become safe to return to. It's a process of reconstruction, building an entirely new internal architecture, new patterns, new boundaries, new relationships, that no longer depend on or orient around the thing that caused the original damage. An empath in genuine recovery isn't pausing their life to see if you'll improve. They's rebuilding something that was never designed with a door left open for you to walk back through. This is where a concept from narrative psychology becomes useful. The idea that healing often requires what therapists call reauthoring, constructing a new story about who you are and where your life is heading. One that doesn't center the person or experience that caused the wound. A story that keeps space open for your return isn't reauthored. It's still trapped in the old narrative, just paused rather than rewritten. Genuine healing requires the empath to finish the story you were part of, and begin an entirely new one, and new stories, by their nature, cast new characters. There's a psychological reason this shift feels so absolute once it occurs. Attachment researchers have long understood that healthy movement past a damaging relationship requires what's sometimes called decathexis, the withdrawal of emotional investment from an attachment figure who has proven unsafe. This isn't a punishment directed at you, it's a survival requirement, An empath cannot fully rebuild a stable, secure internal world, while simultaneously reserving emotional real estate for someone who already demonstrated they've used that access to cause harm again. Viktor Frankl's work on meaning becomes relevant here too. He wrote extensively about how humans reconstruct purpose after devastating loss, not by returning to what was taken from them, but by discovering meaning in an entirely different direction going forward. An empath rebuilding after being broken isn't looking backward, waiting for restoration. They're looking forward, constructing meaning, purpose, and connection in places that have nothing to do with the person who taught them they had to rebuild in the first place. This is the part that's hardest for people to accept once they finally understand what they've lost. Your absence from their future isn't an oversight, something that might change if you just wait long enough or apologize sincerely enough. It's a deliberate architectural choice, made somewhere in the depths of their healing, that the structure being built has no rooms designed for you. You're waiting for an invitation back into a life that was rebuilt, brick by brick, specifically to no longer require your presence. That invitation was never coming, because the blueprint was drawn without you the moment they decided to survive what you did to them. Eventually, it happens. The realization arrives, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once, and you finally understand what you actually lost. The apology forms, sincere this time, maybe for the first time genuinely rooted in understanding rather than self-preservation. You rehearse it, deliver it, and wait for it to land the way you imagine it should. And then you discover something that reorganizes everything you thought you understood about time, forgiveness, and consequence. The regret arrived. The empath, however, is no longer there to receive it in any way that matters. To understand why timing is so devastatingly unforgiving in situations like this, you have to understand what regret actually requires in order to matter to the person receiving it. Regret isn't just an internal experience you're finally having. To hold relational weight, it has to arrive while the other person is still in a state that can be affected by it, still holding some emotional stake in your growth, still capable of being moved by evidence that you finally understand what you did. Once that window closes, once the empath has already metabolized the loss and moved fully into whatever life they've planned, without you, your regret becomes something else entirely. It becomes information they no longer need. This is where a psychological principle about grief becomes essential. Grief researchers have long understood that mourning isn't just about losing a person or relationship. It's about eventually reaching what's called acceptance, a state where the loss has been integrated, where the psyche has stopped actively searching for resolution and has found a kind of stability without it. An empath who has grieved you fully has already done the work your apology arrives too late to assist with. You're offering closure to someone who already closed it themselves, without you, because they had no other choice. There's something philosophically significant in this timing that Soren Kierkegaard captured well, the idea that life must be lived forward, but can only be understood backward. Your understanding of what you lost could only fully form after enough time had passed for consequences to reveal themselves clearly. But that same passage of time is exactly what allowed the empath to finish healing without your insight ever entering the process. The very delay that made your regret possible is the same delay that made it irrelevant to the some person it's directed toward. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it reframes what an apology actually is in this context. It was never really for them at this stage. It's for you, an attempt to unburden yourself from carrying the weight of what you did, to finally say out loud what you should have understood while it still could have changed anything. That doesn't make the apology meaningless. It simply means it belongs to your healing now, not theirs, because their healing already happened, privately, without requiring your participation at all. This is the brutal consequence hiding inside every story like this. It's not that the empath refuses to forgive you out of spite. It's that forgiveness, at this point, isn't even the relevant transaction anymore. They've already moved through it, integrated it, and built a life that doesn't require your remorse to feel complete. Your apology didn't arrive too late to be sincere. It arrived too late to be necessary. And that distinction is far harder to sit with than any rejection could ever be to living. There's a final truth waiting at the end of this story, one that arrives quietly, usually long after everything else has already settled. Whoever comes next, whoever you eventually convince yourself deserves another chance at what you once had, will never love you the way that empath did, before you taught them what loving you actually costs. Not because that next person lacks capacity for love, because that particular kind of love, blind, generous, unguarded, only exists before someone learns the price of extending it to the wrong person. To understand why this loss is permanent in a way most people underestimate, you have to understand what made that original love so rare in the first place. It wasn't given because you'd earned it through demonstrated safety or consistent respect. It was given freely, before evidence, as an act of faith in your potential, rather than a response to your proof. That kind of love, offered without conditions, without requiring you to first show you deserved it, is not a renewable resource that reappears with each new relationship. It's the product of innocence, and innocence, once it learns what betrayal costs, doesn't return to its original form. This is where a psychological reality becomes unavoidable. Every relationship that follows a significant betrayal is shaped, whether consciously or not, by what was learned in the one before it. Attachment researchers describe this as earned security versus original security, the difference between someone who trusts easily because they'd never been taught otherwise, and someone who has to consciously construct trust, piece by piece, after learning firsthand what happens when it's placed carelessly. The empath who loved you before you broke that trust was operating from original security. Anyone who loves you after will be operating from something far more guarded, far more deliberate, and far less total. Soren Kierkegaard wrote about the impossibility of returning to a former state of understanding once genuine insight has occurred, that consciousness, once expanded, cannot simply retract back into its previous shape. The empath who loved you before understanding what you were capable of cannot be recreated in someone new, because that new person will inevitably benefit, or suffer, from lessons learned at your expense. Even if they never hear the full story, even if they never know your name, they will still encounter a version of love shaped by boundaries and discernment that only exist because someone, somewhere, taught the world that unguarded love wasn't safe with you specifically. This is the quiet, brutal consequence that outlasts every apology, every regret, every moment of genuine understanding that arrives too late to matter. It's not just that you lost one person, it's that you altered the very nature of what future love, both theirs and potentially yours, is capable of looking like going forward. What replaces an unbroken empath's love is never as good, not because the next person loves less, but because the next love is built with armor the first one never needed. This is what people rarely calculate when they mistake an empath's patience, compassion, and endless belief for something inexhaustible, something owed to them regardless of how it's treated. You didn't just lose access to one extraordinary person. You lost access to a form of love that only existed in its purest state once, before you were the reason it had to change. Never break an empath. What comes after never comes close to what you had, and it never will again.